Hello there. Welcome back to Z Sci-Fi Stories, and thank you for being such an amazing audience. Unfortunately, YouTube has recently demonetized our channel, leaving us without an operating budget to keep things running. If you enjoyed today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 by scanning the QR code on your screen or clicking the donation link in the description or pinned comment, so we can pay our hardworking team and keep bringing these cosmic tales to you. The Galactic Council of Alliances always believed humanity was an evolutionary punchline, a species barely competent enough to sweep the cosmic floors for their betters. They thought firing the monkeys from their janitorial duties was a brilliant cost-saving measure. But the universe has a funny way of balancing the scales. When the aliens finally handed over the pink slip, they had no idea they were actually signing away the keys to their own empire. The office of the Director of Waste Logistics and Recycling smelled exactly how you would expect a forgotten corner of the galaxy to smell. It was a pungent, heavy blend of synthetic engine grease, stale black coffee, and burnt ozone. Francesco Burt sat behind a dented metal desk that looked like it had barely survived an atmospheric re-entry, wearing a pair of dull, heavily stained protective coveralls. Across from him stood Administrator Zell, a towering, crystalline being whose ceremonial robes flowed with bioluminescent elegance. Zell represented the Galactic Council of Alliances, the undisputed governing body of 300 superior alien races. To the Council, human beings were an evolutionary work in progress. They were considered a lesser, messy species, only qualified to handle the galaxy's hazardous garbage, broken reactor cores, and shattered starship hulls. Zell placed a pristine, glowing tablet onto Francesco's grimy desk, careful not to let his pristine robes touch any of the surrounding filth. The holographic text projected upward, officially terminating the employment of the entire human race. By decree of the High Council, your species is relieved of its sanitation duties, Zell said, his voice a melodic chime dripping with undisguised condescension. You have exactly 72 hours to surrender control of all peripheral junk belts and vacate the orbital facilities. The Council has recently acquired a proprietary strain of artificial, bioengineered refuse-consuming bacteria. Their maintenance costs are significantly lower than providing basic nutritional rations for several billion humans. Zell stood tall, his crystalline facets glowing a bit brighter in arrogant anticipation. He fully expected the human to react like an unevolved primate. He wanted to witness the sudden burst of anger, the desperate pleading, or perhaps the satisfying tears of a lesser creature, realizing its only purpose in the universe had just been rendered completely obsolete. Instead, Francesco simply leaned back in his squeaky mechanical chair, took a slow, deliberate sip from a chipped ceramic mug, and let out a soft sigh. He did not look angry. He did not look devastated. In fact, he just looked thoroughly bored. 72 hours, Francesco repeated, his voice raspy and remarkably calm. Got it. Bacteria it is. Good for the budget, I suppose. Zell blinked, his internal light flickering in brief, genuine confusion. You do not contest this ruling? You do not beg for an extension? Why would I? Francesco shrugged casually. He patted down the pockets of his stained coveralls and retrieved a clicking contraption, an ancient, ink-based ballpoint pen. He then pulled a thick, physical stack of paper from a rusted drawer and tossed it onto the desk with a heavy thud. If you are firing us, we just need to finalize the paperwork. Council regulations, as you well know. Before we can pack up and leave, I need your official signature on this Level 4 scrap asset handover and infrastructure liability waiver. The alien administrator looked at the thick stack of bound paper as if it were a highly contagious biohazard. What is the meaning of this archaic medium? We use digital light signatures. Standard bureaucracy. Francesco replied smoothly, tapping the paper with his pen. "Since we are vacating the premises so abruptly, this document simply states that the Council formally assumes all ownership, risk, and liability for the physical scrap left behind. It simultaneously waives any future claims against human engineering regarding the structural integrity of the trash. You sign on the dotted line, we pack our bags, and the galaxy is all yours." Zell let out a sharp sound that resembled cracking glass, which was the crystalline equivalent of a mocking sneer. Eager to be rid of the grease-stained human and his filthy office, the administrator snatched the primitive pen and hastily scratched his glowing signature onto the paper. He did not bother to read the dense, mundane paragraphs of legal jargon. It was just a pile of garbage, after all. What threat could garbage possibly pose? "Your compliance is noted human," Zell sneered, turning on his heel with a dramatic swish of his glowing robes. "Do not miss the deadline." The heavy office door slid shut, leaving Francesco alone in the quiet hum of his cramped quarters. The human stared at the signed document for a long moment. Slowly, a dangerous, knowing smile crept across his weathered face. He reached deep into his pocket and pulled out a heavily rusted data drive, its casing cracked and held together by faded duct tape. He plugged it into the archaic, bulky terminal sitting on his desk. He typed a single line of code and hit the execution key. At that exact millisecond, light years away in the glamorous galactic core, the primary power grids of all 3 Council capital planets suddenly plummeted by 15%. There were no warning sirens. There were no technical error logs. The energy simply vanished into the void, perfectly silent, as the universe slowly began to realize that the janitors had just locked the doors. Supervisor Vral of the Galactic Council Infrastructure Node prided himself on absolute digital harmony. His control sanctum was a sweeping amphitheater of glowing blue hard-light monitors, tracking every single joule of energy coursing through the 3 capital worlds. When the primary power grids plunged by exactly 15%, Vrel did not panic. Panic was an unpredictable emotion reserved for lesser organic species with poor algorithmic processing capabilities. He simply initiated a standard trace routine. He fully expected to find a blown plasma conduit, a routine system decay, or perhaps a clumsy cybernetic intrusion from a small-time rebel syndicate. What he found instead was a tapestry of cold, terrifying mathematics. The energy was not bleeding aimlessly into the empty void. It was not being forcefully siphoned by malicious code or shadow hackers. According to the foundational telemetry of the Council network, the missing power was being legally routed. It was being seamlessly withdrawn by an authorized system gateway that had woven itself into the main grid over the course of many decades. Vrel pushed his 4 ocular sensors closer to the scrolling data streams, his breath catching in his throat. His long, multi-jointed fingers danced feverishly across the haptic keyboard, digging deep into the highly classified historical archives of the sector. He pulled up the environmental service records assigned specifically to the human race. For exactly 80 years, the humans had been contracted under strict terms to haul away the immense technological waste of the advanced galactic society. The parameters were supposed to be incredibly simple. The humans were meant to tow the garbage out to the peripheral asteroid belts, melt it down in heavy fusion furnaces, and neutralize any lingering radiation. It was supposed to be a graveyard of dead metal. But as Vrel meticulously overlaid the planetary mass displacement charts with the deep space thermal decay signatures of the outer sectors, a horrifying discrepancy slowly materialized on his screens. The humans had never incinerated the trash. The raw material mass had not dissipated into ash and stardust. It had grown exponentially. The humans had been quietly, diligently hoarding every single piece of discarded machinery the superior races deemed obsolete. Sweat, a biological stress function Vrel rarely experienced, began to pool heavily beneath his high ceremonial collar. He bypassed the standard optical filters and ran a deep spectrum structural scan on the peripheral asteroid belts, stripping away the visual camouflage of floating rocks, ice, and cosmic dust. The main monitors immediately flashed a violent, blinding red. Beneath the guise of dead space, billions of supposedly broken reactor cores, snapped subspace antennas, shattered ventilation arrays, and scrapped sublight engines had been meticulously welded together. Director Francesco Burt and his tireless swarms of grease-covered human engineers had not just piled the garbage into mountains, they had secretly stitched the broken pieces into a colossal, living mechanical nervous system. It was a masterpiece of analog engineering, hidden entirely in plain sight. Vrel watched in mounting dread as the raw data finally revealed the true nature of this hidden behemoth. Through 80 years of silent, parasitic symbiosis, the human trash network had slowly taken over the heavy lifting of the capital planets. Because the council systems were notoriously over-engineered and highly prone to bureaucratic bottlenecking, the human-built scrap web had simply stepped in to pick up the slack without anyone noticing. The numbers glaring back at Vrel were utterly suffocating. This unsanctioned, monstrous ring of welded junk was currently processing exactly 60% of all deep space communication traffic. Even worse, it was actively filtering and purifying 40% of the breathable atmosphere for the entire galactic central core. The ruling elite of the Council had been breathing air scrubbed by human garbage for an entire generation, completely oblivious to their absolute dependence on the very species they despised. A frantic alert pinged sharply on Vral's secondary terminal. It was an automated update from the Planetary Legal Registry. Administrator Zell had just filed a document from the Outer Rim. Vral pulled up the file and felt a sudden icy chill cascade down his rigid spine, freezing his very blood. "By the stars! What has he done?" Vral whispered to himself, his voice trembling in the quiet room. It was the Level 4 scrap asset handover and infrastructure liability waiver. He read the archaic legal jargon that Zell had so foolishly and arrogantly ignored. The clauses were a terrifying masterpiece of predatory corporate maneuvering. By signing that single piece of paper, the Galactic Council had officially and legally abdicated all ownership of any structural entity classified as scrap. The document legally transferred full, private ownership of the entire life support and communications network directly to Francesco Burt. It was not a hostile, violent takeover. It was a perfectly legal corporate acquisition. The humans owned the air. The humans owned the data. The janitor was no longer a lowly employee. He was the sole proprietor of the respiratory and nervous systems of the greatest empire in the universe. Vral slammed his fist onto the main console, reaching frantically for the heavy, crimson lever that would trigger a galaxy-wide security alarm. He needed to warn the High Council. He needed to scramble the fleet. But before his trembling fingers could even graze the cold metal of the alarm, the sweeping amphitheater of hard light monitors abruptly died. The pristine blue glow of the control sanctum vanished instantly, plunging Vrel into total, suffocating darkness. Only a single low-resolution screen flickered back to life directly in front of his face. It displayed a crude, blinking text box written entirely in the blocky, unrefined language of humanity. The glowing green message read, "Routine maintenance. Public services will be disconnected in 48 hours." The Grand Hall of the Galactic Council was a triumph of architectural arrogance. Carved entirely from a single, unbroken vein of nebula glass and polished crystalline marble, the colossal amphitheater was designed to make any visiting species feel incredibly small. Today, the room was filled to capacity. Representatives from all the ruling worlds muttered nervously among themselves, their iridescent robes shimmering under the harsh, artificial starlight pouring through the vaulted ceiling. They were waiting for the mastermind who had dared to hold their magnificent empire hostage. The heavy acoustic doors hissed open, flanked by an entire squad of elite, heavily armored guards wielding charged plasma rifles. Francesco Burt strolled into the grand chamber. He was still wearing the same stained coveralls. His heavy work boots left faint, oily smudges on the pristine marble floor. Most offensive of all, he was holding a remarkably flimsy paper cup filled with cheap, instant coffee. The pungent smell of artificial roasted beans aggressively cut through the refined, floral atmosphere of the grand hall. Francesco did not tremble. He did not look around in awe at the floating podiums or the towering statues of ancient conquerors. He simply walked to the center of the interrogation floor, took a long, noisy sip from his paper cup, and let out a satisfied sigh. The sound echoed disrespectfully across the silent room, causing several distinguished diplomats to physically cringe. High Chancellor Obris, a creature of pure, glowing energy contained within a majestic metallic suit, slammed a gavel, made of solid dark matter, onto his floating desk. Human, you stand before the supreme authority of the cosmos. You will immediately surrender the recovery source code to the planetary infrastructure, or you will be vaporized where you stand. This pathetic attempt at cybernetic terrorism ends right now. Dozens of plasma rifles powered up in unison, a low, lethal hum vibrating through the floorboards. The red targeting lasers converged directly on Francesco's chest. The human director merely scratched his stubble, seemingly oblivious to the lethal weapons pointed at his heart. He casually set his coffee cup down on the floor, reached into his worn pockets, and pulled out a clunky, rectangular plastic device. It was a portable holographic projector, heavily taped at the corners. He placed it on the floor, tapped it twice with his boot to get it working, and pressed a physical button. The machine whirred loudly, a fan grinding against its casing, before projecting a low-resolution, two-dimensional screen into the air. A cheerful, horribly compressed audio jingle played, followed by a clashing presentation template featuring bright yellow text on a blue background. The alien dignitaries stared in absolute horror at the primitive software. "I am not a terrorist, Chancellor," Francesco said calmly, pulling a telescopic metal pointer from his pocket. "I am a businessman, and today, I am going to talk to you about the garbage theorem." He smacked the pointer against the floating image. The slide titled "The Garbage Theorem" displayed a very crude, hand-drawn pie chart. You see, for decades, your society operated on a very simple premise. You generated waste, you threw it into the void, and you paid us minimum wage to look at it. But under standard intergalactic property laws, which you wrote, discarded materials legally abandoned in uncontrolled space forfeit all previous chains of ownership. You threw it away. I picked it up by definition. I did not steal your life support systems. You accidentally built your life support systems inside my privately owned trash. A sharp gasp rippled through the amphitheater. The sheer audacity of the human standing before them, using a poorly formatted presentation to justify stealing their air, was beyond comprehension. Minister Vrax, a hulking, reptilian diplomat covered in spiked armor, leapt to his feet. He slammed his fist down on his podium, his voice echoing like rolling thunder. "Enough of this insolence. We will not be lectured on property rights by a grease-stained primate. This is a cheap extortion racket. If you do not hand over the override keys this very second, I will personally order the first armada to mobilize. We will blast every single one of your pathetic garbage stations into subatomic dust. We will plow through your scrap belts until there is nothing left but vapor." The hall erupted in sounds of aggressive agreement. The aliens bared their teeth, flashed their bioluminescence, and demanded immediate military retribution. They were the masters of the universe. They would simply shoot their way out of this inconvenience. Francesco waited patiently for the shouting to die down. He took another slow sip of his instant coffee. Then, he pressed the heavy plastic button on his projector. The slide transitioned with a dizzying, pixelated spinning effect that made several aliens nauseous. I would strongly advise against firing those lasers. Minister, Francesco said, his tone entirely conversational. He pointed at the new slide, which contained a massive wall of incredibly dense legal text. Because, according to Space Maritime Law, Section 4, Paragraph 9, authored by this very council 2,000 years ago, any unprovoked military strike against an active civilian asset automatically triggers severe economic sanctions. Specifically, it legally requires the immediate freezing of all institutional bank accounts belonging to the attacking faction pending a full insurance investigation. Then we will freeze the accounts, Vrax roared, spittle flying from his jagged jaws. We do not care. We will destroy your assets and let our military insurance cover the collateral damage. The council has trillions of credits in the reserve fund. Francesco offered a devastating, razor-sharp smile. It was a smile that made the plasma rifle guards involuntarily take a step back. Ah, yes, Francesco chuckled, leaning against his telescopic pointer. The Galactic Military Insurance Corporation, a highly profitable institution. You see, humanity has been very frugal over the last 80 years. We did not spend our garbage collection salaries on fancy robes or glowing marble. We invested it, very quietly, through thousands of dummy shell corporations. The human tapped the final bullet point on his outdated presentation. As of last Tuesday, humanity owns a controlling 65% share in the Galactic Military Insurance Corporation. We are the primary underwriters for your entire armada. If you order your ships to blow up my privately owned garbage, your own military law will force you to pay the insurance claim directly to me. And considering the sheer volume of scrap out there, the payout will instantly bankrupt the entire empire. You will literally have to sell your capital planets just to cover the deductible. A suffocating, heavy silence slammed into the Grand Hall. The low hum of the plasma rifles suddenly sounded very weak. The majestic crystalline room felt as though it were shrinking, collapsing inward under the crushing weight of a bureaucratic checkmate. Francesco picked up his paper cup, giving it a gentle swirl. So, Minister Vrax, would you like to fire the first shot, or should we move on to the next slide? Supreme Commander Kalen of the First Galactic Armada possessed a military record forged in the fires of 1,000 conquered suns. He was a warlord of the old blood, a hulking apex predator, encased in gleaming dark matter armor. While the soft, pampered politicians cowered in their marble halls, paralyzed by legal loopholes and insurance threats. Kylan sneered at their cowardice. He would not be humiliated by a race of hairless apes whose greatest cultural achievement was a paper coffee cup. Laws and contracts meant absolutely nothing to a dreadnought equipped with world cracker cannons. Standing on the command bridge of his flagship, Kalen stared at the tactical holomap. He decisively slammed his armored fist onto the override console, bypassing the High Council entirely. I do not care about maritime law, Kalen roared, his voice booming across the fleet communications network. Initiate a lightning strike directly on the primary human command station. We will rip the override codes from that primate's cold, dead hands and seize physical control of the grid. All ships, synchronize navigation, spool up the hyperdrives. We jump in 3 seconds. Across the glittering orbital shipyards of the capital, thousands of sleek, heavily armed warships ignited their thrusters in perfect, terrifying unison. The fabric of reality began to warp and bend around the massive armada as their jump engines tore a hole into the dimensional ether. They plunged into hyperspace, a glorious tidal wave of unstoppable military might, streaking toward the human-controlled outer rim. Then, the universe aggressively pulled the emergency brake. It did not happen gradually. There was a violent, ear-splitting shriek of tearing metal as the subspace corridors simply evaporated. Thousands of elite warships were unceremoniously vomited out of the hyperlanes, violently tumbling into the pitch-black void of uncharted space. Inertial dampeners screamed in protest as dreadnoughts spun wildly out of control, narrowly avoiding catastrophic collisions. Warning klaxons wailed across every bridge in the fleet. Kalen picked himself up from the polished floor of his command deck, his armor sparking from the sudden kinetic shock. "Report!" he bellowed, shoving a dazed navigation officer aside to stare at the main sensor screen. "Did they detonate a gravity mine? Where are we?" "We are stranded, Commander!" the chief navigator gasped, his tentacles trembling violently over the dead console. "We are light years away from the target." The hyperlanes did not collapse from an attack. They simply ceased to exist. The stability anchors just vanished from the network. "That is impossible," Kalen snarled. "The Galactic Council designed those jump gates 10 years ago. They are flawless marvels of quantum engineering." "Sir, look at the deep scan telemetry," the navigator pleaded, pointing a shaking appendage at the raw data streaming across the screen. The truth, buried under a decade of willful ignorance, finally laid itself bare. The beautiful, glowing silver rings of the hyperspace gates that the Council so proudly flaunted were nothing but empty, decorative shells. The raw cosmic energy required to keep a tier in space-time stable was mathematically impossible for those elegant rings to handle. Instead, hidden deep within the shadows of nearby dead moons and asteroid clusters, were the true anchors. The humans had secretly stabilized the dimensional corridors using millions of broken thermal radiators and discarded, leaking battery cores. They had jury-rigged the galaxy's most advanced transportation network using literal garbage, binding the chaotic energy of hyperspace together with rusty wire and sheer engineering spite. The majestic council fleets had been surfing on a wave of human trash for 10 years, and now, the trash had decided to stop cooperating. Across the dead screens of the stranded armada, a single audio channel forced itself open. It was not a grand declaration of war. It was not a villainous monologue. It was a perfectly calm, entirely emotionless, automated artificial intelligence voice, echoing into the dark. "Notice, space gates are temporarily locked due to unpaid private infrastructure toll fees. Please contact your local waste management representative to settle your outstanding balance. Thank you for using human transit." Back in his cramped, grease-stained office, Francesco Burt tilted his head back, swallowed the last cold drop of his instant coffee, and tossed the empty paper cup into a waste bin. A terrifying, absolute silence fell over the cosmos. The great Galactic Alliance, an empire that spanned millions of light years, was instantly paralyzed. The majestic dreadnoughts floated aimlessly in the dark, completely stripped of their momentum, drifting harmlessly like cheap mechanical toys with drained batteries. Cargo freighters stalled in the void. Supply chains vanished. The ruling aliens stared out of their viewports into the abyss, the bitter, humiliating reality finally sinking into their advanced, superior minds. Humanity was never a pathetic joke. They were never just the maids sweeping the cosmic floors. While the council was busy arguing over ceremonial robes and marble statues, the humans had quietly become the microchips embedded in the flesh of the empire. They had dug their roots into the very foundation of the galaxy, slowly replacing the bones, and ultimately becoming the spinal cord of civilization. Without the janitors, the empire could not even take a single step forward. The collapse did not take decades or years. It took exactly 12 hours. Across the peripheral worlds of the Galactic Council, absolute panic erupted like a violent solar flare in a dry nebula. Without the human-stabilized hyperspace gates, the meticulously organized interstellar supply chains completely snapped in half. Cargo freighters carrying synthetic proteins and essential medical supplies were abruptly stranded, light years away from their intended destinations. Supermarkets and nutrient dispensaries on the outer rim planets were stripped bare by frantic citizens in a matter of minutes. Riots consumed the glowing marble streets as billions of superior, highly evolved beings suddenly realized they had absolutely no idea how to survive without their automated delivery systems. The greatest empire in the universe dissolved into terrifying chaos the moment their convenience was taken away. Deep inside the grand hall of the capital, the insufferable arrogance of the High Council had completely evaporated. The towering holographic projection of High Chancellor Obris flickered to life inside Francesco Bert's dingy, grease-stained office. The Chancellor no longer looked like a majestic being of pure energy. He looked thoroughly exhausted, his bioluminescence dimming with sheer, unadulterated desperation. "Name your price, human," Obris pleaded, his melodic voice now heavy with humiliating defeat. "We surrender. Whatever you desire, the Council will grant it immediately. Do you want raw credits? We can transfer trillions of galactic standards into your private accounts right now. Do you want our core quantum technology? It is yours. We are even willing to offer humanity a permanent seat on the High Council, complete with supreme veto power over any legislative decision in the galaxy. Just give us back the grid, please." Francesco leaned forward, resting his stained elbows on his dented metal desk. He looked at the desperate alien ruler and let out a short, genuinely tired laugh. "Supreme veto power?" Francesco asked, raising an eyebrow in mild amusement. "Chancellor, do you have any idea how boring your government actually is? Your legal system is incredibly bloated. Your administrative structure is hopelessly inefficient. Why would humanity ever want a seat on your council? That just sounds like a massive waste of time, sitting in endless, pointless meetings. We are mechanics and waste managers, not politicians. We do not want to rule your empire." Obris stared at the human, completely bewildered by the rejection. "Then what do you want? If this was not a violent rebellion, if this was not an attempt to conquer us, what have you been planning for the last 80 years? "It is exactly what I told you earlier," Francesco replied, casually interlocking his fingers. "It is just business. This was not a military coup. It was a corporate merger and acquisition of your fundamental infrastructure. You see, when you rely entirely on a third party to manage your life support, your transit, and your communications, you do not really own your house anymore. You just live in it. As of this morning, the Galactic Council of Alliances is officially renting space inside humanity's privately owned property. You are our tenants." Before the Chancellor could process the sheer humiliation of that statement, Francesco's bulky terminal sent a massive data packet directly to the High Council's central mainframe. "I have just forwarded the new residential and commercial lease agreement," Francesco stated cheerfully. "Since you are now renting your own empire from us, we need to establish some firm ground rules. Rent is due on the first of every standard cycle. Utilities are heavily metered, and there are very strict financial penalties for late payments." Back in the Grand Hall, the alien diplomats frantically opened the document on their glowing screens. Their expressions rapidly morphed from despair to absolute, unadulterated horror. The lease agreement was exactly 12,000 pages long. It was not written in the elegant, straightforward binary codes of the Council. It was written in the most terrifying, deliberately incomprehensible language in the known universe, human legalese, drafted by a hidden consortium of Earth's most ruthless corporate lawyers. The contract was an inescapable labyrinth of hidden trapdoors, compound interest rates, absurd liabilities, and predatory maintenance fees. The Council immediately fed the document into their most advanced translation supercomputers. The massive quantum processors whirred frantically, attempting to decipher the human legal clauses regarding force majeure and third-party indemnity. Within 3 minutes, the supercomputers overloaded. Their cooling systems failed, and the glowing consoles began shooting violent sparks across the room. The artificial intelligence literally crashed, entirely unable to process the sheer logical insanity of the fine print. The aliens were completely trapped. Every legal exit was blocked. Every logical loophole was sealed by the stubborn, predatory cunning of human bureaucracy. The atmosphere in the Grand Hall turned suffocatingly toxic as the horrifying realization set in. They could not fight the humans with lasers, and they could not outsmart them in court. They could only pay the rent, unless they broke the ultimate galactic taboo. High Chancellor Obrus violently cut the transmission to Francesco's office. He turned to the panicked, screaming diplomats in the hall, his energy field flaring with uncontrollable rage. "We will not be enslaved by garbage collectors. If we cannot win the legal battle, we will erase the board entirely." Driven entirely by blind panic and wounded pride, the Chancellor authorized the unthinkable. He bypassed all safety protocols and ordered the immediate arming of the quantum electromagnetic pulse, an ancient, forbidden superweapon. It was a device of pure devastation, designed to instantly incinerate any active computer network, digital processor, and electronic grid within a 10,000 light-year radius. It would plunge the galaxy into the Dark Ages, but it would also instantly vaporize the entire human garbage network. The Council was willing to burn their own house down just to kill the spiders living in the walls. With a trembling, glowing hand, Obrus authorized the launch sequence, unleashing a silent, invisible wave of absolute technological death across the stars. The invisible wave of the quantum electromagnetic pulse erupted from the central core like a silent, devastating tsunami. It was a weapon of absolute technological erasure. As the invisible surge of energy violently swept across the stars, it carried the final, desperate hope of the Galactic Council. The pulse was designed to instantly scramble any advanced digital processor, shatter quantum entanglement codes, and melt sophisticated cybernetic pathways. It washed over the peripheral junk belts in a blinding flash of exotic radiation, engulfing the entirety of the human-controlled infrastructure. High Chancellor Obrus and the terrified alien diplomats watched their tactical screens, waiting for the massive human grid to finally burn out and die. They waited, and they waited. Nothing happened. The life support systems did not fail. The communication relays did not go dark. In fact, the human infrastructure continued to hum, along with the exact same steady, irritatingly reliable rhythm as before. The heavy acoustic doors of the Grand Hall suddenly hissed open. Francesco Burt casually strolled into the majestic amphitheater, carrying a heavy, rusted metal toolbox in one hand and a portable, incredibly noisy dot matrix printer in the other. He ignored the shocked gasps of the alien dignitaries and walked straight up to the towering High Chancellor. "Did you just try to fry my network with a quantum pulse?" Francesco asked, sounding more amused than angry. "How?" Obrus whispered, his energy field flickering wildly in absolute disbelief. "That weapon deletes all digital code. It scrambles every high-level operational matrix within 10,000 light-years. Your network should be reduced to molten slag." "That is your problem, Chancellor," Francesco sighed, setting his heavy toolbox down on the pristine marble floor. "You assume we built our systems using your fragile, over-engineered digital code. We did not. Our entire operating system does not have a single line of quantum programming. It runs entirely on mechanical relays, physical steel gears, crude analog copper wiring, and heavy physical switches. You cannot electromagnetically pulse a bicycle. You just shot a highly advanced digital weapon at a giant, galaxy-sized mechanical clock. It completely ignored your pulse because it does not even speak your technological language." A profound, horrifying realization washed over the alien rulers. They were entirely powerless. They could not outsmart the humans. They could not fight them, and they could not even destroy them. "But do not worry," Francesco continued, his tone suddenly shifting from mocking to deadly serious. "I did not hijack your infrastructure just to extort you for rent money. We did it because you were too busy sitting in pointless committee meetings to look out the window." Francesco reached into his stained coveralls and pulled out a bulky, heavy mechanical remote control. It had a single, massive red button. He pressed it down with a loud, satisfying click. "Look up," the human commanded. The crystalline ceiling of the Grand Hall faded into full transparency, revealing the vast expanse of the cosmos above the capital worlds. At first, the aliens only saw the familiar, comforting blanket of stars. But then, a terrifying anomaly appeared on the edge of the system. A colossal, roaring storm of volatile plasma, a stellar extinction event of unimaginable proportions, was surging directly toward the central core. It was a wave of pure, boiling cosmic fire, capable of incinerating the three capital planets in a matter of seconds. The Council had completely missed it. Their sensors had been entirely focused inward on their own political disputes. Panic instantly seized the Grand Hall, but before a single alien could scream, the human trash network reacted. Across the peripheral belts, millions of gigantic pieces of discarded scrap metal, broken engine blocks, and shattered starship hulls suddenly groaned and shifted. Powered by the crude analog network, massive arrays of artificial gravity generators flared to life. The floating mountains of garbage slammed together, interlocking their jagged edges like the pieces of a flawless, galaxy-spanning puzzle. In a matter of moments, the raw, ugly trash of 1,000 worlds transformed into a breathtakingly magnificent mechanical Dyson wall. It was a shield of unprecedented scale, a crude but infinitely sturdy barrier of solid metal that completely wrapped around the vulnerable side of the capital system. The plasma storm hit the wall with the force of a dying sun. The sky above the capital planets ignited into a terrifying ocean of boiling crimson fire. The sheer kinetic impact caused the marble floors of the Grand Hall to violently tremble. But the wall held. The heavy, ugly, discarded trash of the universe absorbed the apocalyptic heat, glowing a brilliant, blinding white as it safely deflected the doomsday storm away from the fragile worlds below. It was a scene of awe-inspiring, chaotic beauty. The majestic rulers of the Galactic Council stood in absolute silence, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the miracle happening above their heads. The anger and arrogance that had defined their empire for millennia melted away, replaced by a profound, crushing sense of shame and boundless reverence. They had looked down on humanity for centuries. They had treated them like dirty, unevolved animals. Yet, when the end of the world arrived, it was the lowly garbage collectors who had quietly woven a blanket of trash to keep the entire galaxy safe. The storm eventually passed, leaving the massive mechanical wall scarred but victorious. The Grand Hall remained completely silent. Francesco Burt let out a long, tired breath. He picked up his noisy, portable printer and pressed a heavy plastic button. The machine shrieked and ground its gears, slowly spitting out a thick, endless stream of rough paper. Francesco casually walked over to High Chancellor Obris, who was still standing completely petrified behind his floating desk. The human tore the massive stack of paper from the machine and firmly shoved it into the stunned alien ruler's glowing hands. "That is the invoice for the Emergency Rescue and Planetary Protection Service," Francesco said calmly. 400 pages of itemized physical labor, hazardous environment fees, and analog system maintenance. I expect the first installment paid in full by Friday, without waiting for a response. Francesco bent down, picked up his heavy, rusted toolbox, and turned his back on the most powerful beings in the universe. "Now, if you will excuse me," the human muttered, his heavy boots clanking against the marble as he walked out of the room. "I have a rusty water pipe on level 4 that desperately needs welding. Thank you so much for listening to today's story, everyone. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this cosmic tale and want to help our channel survive, please consider supporting us with just $1 by scanning the QR code on your screen or using the donation link in the description or pinned comment. Your incredible generosity helps pay our hardworking staff, allows them to feed their families, and ensures we can keep creating these wonderful stories for you. Thank you, and I will see you in the next one.